Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Neha Suri. Today, I'll be presenting with my colleague, Paul Geringer. We're both at the University of Maryland, Department of Ag and Agricultural Resource Economics, excuse me. We work with the Ag Law Education Initiative, and today we are going to talk about some legal basics for farm succession. So we work at the Ag Law Education Initiative, which is a pretty special program within the university extension system. We are a collaboration between us, our law school, and the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. Let's see if I can. Sorry, Paul, how do I advance? Sorry, everyone, just getting used to the new technology here. Thank you. Oh, I see it. Thank you. We are funded in part by the University of Maryland Empower. And as a disclaimer, this presentation is intended to provide general information, not legal counsel, especially if you're in a state other than Maryland. Unlike us, you may have different laws that affect your business or your personal situation. So for specific legal advice about how these issues today might apply to your situation, please make sure you consult an attorney. And just for some additional info for everyone, we do participate in a blog called the Maryland Risk Management Education blog. We have kind of timely, updated information about a variety of agricultural risk management and economics topics. Breaking news about regulations, federal law, things like that. So feel free to check that out. Paul also has a podcast that comes out twice a month. It's kind of a conversational, easygoing way to digest some of the publications and work and research that we've done at the Ag Law Initiative. It's available wherever podcasts are found. Okay, so with that, I will hand it over to Paul to kick us off with what I think will be a very fun introduction to our topics for today.
Yes. So thank you, Meha. I'm bringing up the chat just to make sure I didn't miss anything. I'm gonna get rid of that. So yeah, so we're gonna start off with a little bit of fun and have you think about this from what should you be doing in a farm succession issue as we watch a clip from Parks and Rec dealing with one of the characters thinking about developing his own estate plan.
Paul, sorry, we can't quite hear you.
That requires me to unmute my microphone. So go into the chat box if you don't mind and think about this. So what steps or path did Ron take on his estate planning journey? So to give you a little bit of background on Ron, if you never watched Parks and Recreation, at this point, he's recently married. He has a young son with his wife. And at the same time, he has 2 stepdaughters. So, just give us some thoughts. What did you see in the video clip as to, the steps or path that Ron has taken on his estate planning journey? And I'll give you a few minutes to type some stuff in. Yes, he's accepted his mortality. Yes, he thought about, his children in this. It doesn't give a lot of examples as to what will happen with the rest of his estate. He did get professional assistance. He did go from a very simple will to a very complex will, which is probably needed for apparently a man of his wealth. So bringing up the rest of the thoughts we had in this. Well, somebody's brought this up. He consulted professionals. He did take into consideration his life changes, children, new marriage. If you think about it, what did his will start off with? Somebody put simple. It started off as to whoever kills him gets the money. It's gone to actually taking care of his kids by the end. Yes, that is also correct. He really did not consult a financial planner in any of this. And he did think about his goals. and his priorities and all this. If we think about it very early on, his main reason he doesn't want to think about his kids is he doesn't want them to be the type of people that would buy their own wooden furniture. He wants them to be the type of people that would make their wooden furniture. So he does go from thinking about that to thinking about taking care of his children and giving them some security down the road. I'm not seeing any other thoughts come into the chat box, so I will move on to the next slide. So with this tonight, we're going to talk a lot about, and we've kind of talked about this throughout the whole series, it's just sort of what's the importance of this, whether it be from health insurance down to financial planning for retirement to business planning to communication. This all plays into the importance of succession and estate planning. Tonight, we're really going to talk about that a little bit more in depth, especially Mayhaw's going to talk about goal setting and a few other steps along the way. Then we're going to talk about, you know, you go into this, Ron finds his team members to do all this from talking to his friend. You may not be so lucky. You may have to go out and actually interview these people, from an attorney to a financial planner to whoever else is needed for your team. So we'll talk a little bit about how to communicate with your team. We've already really covered how to communicate with your family and other steps, but we're going to bring in some examples into that and tie it back in so you can start thinking about why that really does play into a lot of this. And then we'll talk finally about the tools of all this. So why is this important? You know, I want you to think about this for a second. Why is estate planning really important? And not just estate planning, but succession planning important to farm families?
So if people want to put a few thoughts into the chat about why planning is particularly important for farm families, or why you yourself are interested in this series. So your wishes are fulfilled. Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah. Let's see if I can open this up. To have control over how your assets are distributed. I think my colleague Paul came up with this term, but you know, farmers aren't control freaks, they're control enthusiasts, right? And succession plan is one way to make sure you have control over the assets you've worked so hard to attain over your life. Yep, succession among family members, trying to reduce conflict, which is something Kay Megan talked about. Yes, dividing up the farm or keeping it together. It's different from selling a residential property. There's economic or business concerns about splitting up parcels of land. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for your thoughts. So let's get started with the next slides. So if we step back from the agricultural perspective, really, who needs to consider a succession plan? You know, the answer is everyone. Not just agricultural families, but any family that has any type of asset. So whether it's property, whether it's, you know, jewelry, cash, a business, pretty much everyone needs to be considering a succession plan. You know, all the way from the royal family of England to Ron Swanson and the clip we saw, to even Dolly Parton, who I think recently did an interview saying that she had just now, I guess, started considering her succession and estate plan. So, you know, if Dolly can do it, so can we, right? But who else needs to consider a succession plan? How about a new family after a divorce or a reorganization of the family? More complex families with children from previous marriages, or more complex business relationships between siblings. Farms with limited liquidity. This gets into the comment that was made about there might be some cash involved with selling, but if you sell, the farm may no longer be operable. And farms on the verge of viable size. So similarly, if a farm is just big enough and you sell off part of it, perhaps you get into a situation where it's no longer operable. So for a lot of these reasons, everyone needs to consider a succession plan, but especially farm families. So if everyone could get into the chat again and put in their thoughts about what's the difference between succession planning and estate planning. We've been using these words a little interchangeably over the last 4 sessions, but they are different. So if anyone could put in the chat their thoughts on the difference between the two terms. Okay, we have one answer here. Continuing a business entity versus carrying out the wishes of the deceased. Okay, right. So succession is more about the business and the estate is more about the person who has passed on. Yeah, that's a good distinction. I like that. I actually hadn't thought about it that way. Succession allows you to maintain operations in a way that you would hope for. Okay, right. So succession, again, focused more on the business entity aspect. Okay, great. Thanks for your responses. So I'm gonna just put up what I thought the difference could be. So I thought, like the answers that we got, succession is more about the business itself. So will the business remain viable? Is there a leader in the pipeline? Is there someone with strong management skills who understands the nuances and details and the requirements of getting things done on the farm and for the farm business? Whereas the estate is more holistic. It includes things beyond just the farm entity or enterprises. And it, for example, includes personal affairs, healthcare considerations, and a little bit later we'll get into some examples of just wishes of the deceased, as was mentioned earlier. So I have another question then. Is one more important than the other? I'm guessing no. Yeah, I would agree with that. So, there's no hard and fast answers here, and unfortunately you're gonna hear a lot of it depends from us. But in my opinion, no, I don't think one is more important than the other. Particularly if your goal is to keep the farm business going, succession planning is absolutely as important as estate planning. Grooming your successor, making sure they know where the passwords are, where the keys are, how to lead a business, what a certain type of farmhand needs in terms of direction, which vendors to deal with, things like that. That's all just as important as making sure your will is in tip-top shape, your trust is in tip-top shape, and those documents are all set up. So just to wrap it up here, and I think all the comments in the chat have really hit upon this. Why is succession planning important? So there's something called intestacy law, which is that if there's no will, if there's no documentation, as we heard in the video, the state decides who gets what. And depending on your state, there are different priorities or frameworks that they use. But most of the time, the state decides that your spouse and then your descendants gets an equal amount of the remaining assets. But that may not be helpful for you, because if you have 3 descendants and none of them want to farm, perhaps the farm won't continue. Or if you have children from previous marriage or a spouse from a previous marriage that you still support, that person may be totally cut out if the state is deciding who's getting your assets. So for that reason, it's really important to have documentation in place to avoid falling into intestacy law issues. Another important thing that's really specific to the agricultural community is that 60 to 70% of family-owned farms actually don't make it to the next generation. And I believe that this number just continues to go up as you get to the 3rd generation, the 4th generation, and the 5th. So for us who work in the agricultural industry and have a vested interest in keeping our farms healthy and working and strong, this statistic really scares us. A lot of farmers, our primary operators, are getting to retirement age, and it's important to ensure that our farms stay strong and viable onto that next generation. And we've heard this a couple of times in the chat now, but if you don't have a succession plan for your business, your preferences and goals may not carry on to the next generation. So now we're going to move on to talking a little bit more about goals. Okay, so let's take it back to perhaps elementary school, grade school for us today. What are goals? Now, I personally think, I know this sounds like such an obvious question. We hear the word probably every day in some context or the other. But what is a goal really? And I think when we take time to consider what a goal is, it helps develop those goals moving forward. So a goal basically is a statement of what you hope to achieve. So it's something that you think will actually happen or plan to actually make happen. But something that I find important about goals, and I think sometimes gets overlooked, is that your goals change based on circumstances and time, which means that you have to reevaluate them and update them. You know, my goal when I was a 4-year-old was to be a singing waitress. I personally don't even know what a singing waitress is anymore, but that was my goal. I used to practice my songs, and I used to practice carrying platters of, plastic food from my dollhouse. That's not my goal anymore. So as we age, as the family systems change, as the market conditions change, goals will also change. And so it's important to update financial, legal, succession, and estate planning documents based on those goals changing. So here's some examples of goals here. You don't have to put them into the chat or anything, but just something to think about is, what are your goals? And especially if there are any of you here with an intergenerational group, if you're here with your child or if you're here with your parent, think about these goals together as well. So how many of you want to retire from farming? Some people do, some people don't. How many want the farm to continue in the next generation? Does it have to be the children that continue the farm? Can it be a neighbor or someone else that you trust, a manager that you trust? Do you have to provide for family members or children with medical issues or other disability issues, so that access to cash, to liquidity is important? So if we start thinking about these goals, they'll start to shape the types of decisions that are made when it comes to developing the legal tools that Paul is going to talk about later on this evening. So I really liked this slide. That's why I kind of made it the whole screen here. But I saw this quote: "A goal without a plan is just a wish." And I thought that was pretty helpful to put things in perspective for me, because my big goal of being a singing waitress was really actually a wish, because as far as I know, there's no career counseling or preparatory schools available for a career as a singing waitress. So the next few slides, and actually the rest of the talk, is going to be focused on that planning part. So how to develop goals with a plan, and how to take that plan to the finish line. So one example of goals that have a plan kind of baked in are SMART goals. SMART is an acronym. Many of you may have heard this term before, but the initials in the acronym stand for specific, measurable, action-oriented, reasonable or relevant, and timely. And I'm going to go through an example on the next slide of goals that meet these 5 criteria. So an example of a goal is, I want to make more money on my farm. Great, me too. But on the next slide, I'll show a specific example of a SMART goal that would hopefully lead to more money, but hits on these 5 components. Okay, so here's the example. We're going to diversify the farm operation to include agritourism, with my daughter as the manager, to increase farm income by $20K a year by 2021, so that she, the daughter, can develop leadership skills. So it's specific because we're talking about an agritourism operation. It's measurable because we put a dollar amount or a number on the goal. It's action-oriented because there's an action step here. Daughter will be the manager. And this is also really helpful for succession planning, because she's getting to learn something while you're still around to impart your knowledge. It's another action and reasonable goal here is so that she can develop leadership skills. You know, it's not that she's going to take over the business or that she's going to be able to spin it off into her own, but it's a reasonable, smaller goal of developing leadership skills that'll guide how you enact this plan. And it's timely. So there's a time frame on when this is going to happen. Now, fall 2021, you know, with, for example, COVID right now, it might not be the best time to add agritourism, right? Things change, so we have to reevaluate and update the plan. But putting that date kind of creates some accountability for you and the people that are helping you complete this plan and achieve this goal. Because then it's not a far out in the future date, it's just something that, you know, you're gonna have a date on the calendar. And if you get there and you haven't met it, maybe that's okay, but at least you have something you're aiming for. Something else to keep in mind with goals is that, you know, we all have a lot of them, whether it's passing on the farm, whether it's adding a new enterprise, whether it's losing those last 10 pounds or running a marathon or traveling somewhere interesting. All of those are important goals, but perhaps we can't reach all of them, at least not all at the same time. And so for that reason, it's important to prioritize and reevaluate goals. Which ones are the most important? And I wish I had bolded this one here, but the second sentence, are these priorities in line with your partner and your family? That's really important, because if your goal is to retire and go live in Hawaii, but your spouse's goal is to, you know, drop dead in the field, there are going to have to be some conversations about that. And last week, Kay Megan Washington gave some tips on how to have that communication when there are differences of opinion or values. When we do these sessions in person, there's a sheet that I like to hand out, especially to those who are there with an intergenerational group. And actually just try writing down your goals. You know, you each take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever, write down your goals and then compare it to each other. Maybe you'll find you totally overlap, or maybe you'll find that not so much. And that can be a really important conversation to have, because if you have your goals clear in your mind, it makes all of the complex and difficult, sometimes difficult decision-making that comes with these legal and financial decisions much, much easier, because you're going in with a strong sense of what you want, what's best for you and your family, and that way it's much easier to select financial and legal tools that help fit into your plan and help you achieve these goals. And with that, I will pass it back over to Paul to talk about how to find people to help you achieve these goals.
Thanks, Meha. And so as you go through this process, it's not always easy to have to think about, how do I interview my own team to be able to help you and guide you through this process. It's probably not something where you've thought about, how do I hire an attorney? How do I do, you know, how do I look at the right type of financial planner to help me? How do I work with, you know, whoever it might be? You might need to look at farm managers to help you put together the business plan. It may take a number of people to do this. Oh. So I'm always asked, and May has asked this a lot too when we do these in person, is how do I find, you know, fill in the blank to help me and develop my succession plan? And this is almost always my standard answer. I really have no idea, because I don't know who you work well with. We all work well with certain people. We don't work well with other people. So we have to think about who best works with us and what is our best working relationship with other people. So how do you start thinking about this? Well, you can contact professional associations. You can contact your state bar association. In Maryland, you can contact the Maryland State Bar Association. There's an estates and trust section that you can start with. There's an ag law section as well. Delaware, similar. I don't know where everybody else is located at, but these are things you can think about starting with. You can do what Ron did in the video. You can look for your neighbors for recommendations. You can reach out to one of us, Meha or I, for a list, and we can help provide you with at least a list of attorneys that we know in the area that may be willing to work with you on this, or it may be an accountant, or it may be somebody else. Don't just hire the first person you go in and talk to. Sit down, think about, okay, what works well for me in a, when I'm working in any relationship with people. And then start developing some questions. We have a fact sheet to kind of help with this, to help you start thinking about, how do I ask these people questions? The biggest question you should almost always ask is, how will you bill me for costs? How many people like to get unexpected bills in the mail? Does anybody like to get, just randomly out of the blue that you owe $500, $600, $700, $1,000?
No, thank you.
Yeah, you're not going to like this when the attorney does it either. And we don't like hounding you for money in the end when this is going on. So the thought is, ask up front, how are you going to bill me? What are the costs? How is this going to work with? Think about how you like to communicate with people, and think about how you want to be communicated with. We all communicate differently. That's kind of what Kay Megan has talked about last week in her presentation. And you really do have to think about what works best for you. It may be, in the end, you really like just getting short, simple text messages. You may like an email. You may want a phone call. How do you want that communication to come to you, and in what form? Sit down and think about that. Ask the attorney that question. Ask them how they will bill you. Make sure you know this up front. They're going to have a communication style. You're going to have a communication style. Make sure it works. The other thing to sit down and think about is, ask them just bluntly, how would you handle my situation? Just kind of have them give you some overviews of how they've handled this in the past, what they've done, and sit down and think, is that going to work for me? Is it something I'm comfortable with doing? Is there some other stuff that I think may need to be done? You're definitely probably not the expert in estate planning, but you may have ideas as to what will work for your individual family members, and how best you think this should be handled. Come in with those ideas, but at least be willing to ask them, how they would handle it. And if they at least come in with a decent plan that you think, from what you may know, may work, sit down, and you may want to continue talking to them and thinking about hiring that individual as somebody that's going to be on your team. If they don't really have a good handle on this situation, this may not be the person you really want to bring on to your team. And you should do this for every member of the team, whether it be the accountant you're going to work with. And the attorney may come in, they may be someone that handles estate planning. They may come in with a group of accountants they're already comfortable with working with. So you may just start there, and it may have to expand if you're not comfortable with any of them, or you may have to go on to a new attorney. So these are things you need to think about as we're going through this process. The other things you should consider asking is, just what fields do you work in? If they don't do estate planning, if they don't do, tax issues related to farms, if they're not actively involved in that area, this may not be a person you want to deal with, because there may be too much of a learning curve. It goes hand in hand with, do you typically work on this issue? If they don't normally, there's going to be a learning curve that's potentially involved there, and it may not be worth you taking the time to get involved with that individual. They may be able to handle it, competently, but it may not be something you're willing to take a risk on. That's something you have to think about. Are they members of a professional association? Are they a member of some sort of professional association that would provide them, up-to-date information on estate planning, estate tax, you name it, that's going to go into this process? That's something, again, for you to think about and to consider. Yeah, and Maria brings up a good point. You may end up paying for it if you're paying by the hour if the person does not understand the issues. You may not really want to have to pay someone to learn on the job, especially with this, where it may end up costing you a little bit of money, just depending on how complicated it is. And the other thing just to ask is, ask for a professional reference. Accountants and other people may be willing to hand that out in the profession. or ask them to describe their typical client. Just get a sense of who they normally work with. Do they normally work with farmers? Do they normally work with, you know, other types of businesses? Who is that normal client, and who do we need to be paying attention to in this, that they may or not be able to work best with you? Take into consideration that whoever you develop this team with, whoever you're interviewing and whoever you're working with, these are the people that you need to feel comfortable with. Remember, at almost all times, you are the client during this. You're paying the bills. You're sort of the boss in all of this, so you do deserve some respect in all of this process. If you're not feeling like you're getting that, you may want to talk to the attorney, the accountant, whoever you're dealing with, to sort of see if you can fix the situation. Or if it's beyond that, you may have to consider going with someone else. Hopefully, if you do the interview process and you feel comfortable with them, it's going to reduce a lot of the need for you to have to go back and, you know, reevaluate this down the road. But take that into consideration, that you control a lot more of this than what you may feel like in the process. It's foreign, it's strange to you. In a lot of cases, terms may be used that you don't understand, but this is something you need to take into consideration as you're doing this, just to keep yourself abreast of what's going on, so you can help make the best choices for what's going to go into this that will work for your family. And now I think it's Meha's turn to sort of give a little bit of a follow-up on communications.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, so for those of you who attended the session last week with Kay Megan and Lori, you got a full full in-depth look at communications and business planning. But I wanted to share kind of maybe a bit funny, maybe a bit strange example of where communications and the legal tools interact. And I will say that, credit to Paul for actually digging up this example here. So let me pull it up for you. Okay, so this is a little bit hard to read, so I'm just going to leave it up here for about a minute or two and let folks kind of let it sink in, and then we'll go ahead and summarize and talk about what's going on here. And I do hope that, it's all in good fun. So I do apologize if it's a bit uncomfortable. Maybe it's just my own sense of humor there. If anyone wants to share their reactions in the chat, feel free to do that. But now that you've all had a few moments to look this over, let's talk about it. Okay, so I believe this was from Reddit, Paul, is that right? Yep. Okay, so this is from Reddit, which is, a place where anyone on the internet can say basically whatever they want. And here's a good example of that. So we have a woman, her husband is older than her, perhaps not keeping too well. So she took the initiative and started the conversation about the end of life, plans, will, things like that. And the husband has quite the creative approach to the afterlife. So he wants the skull of his body to be cleaned and placed on the mantelpiece, and the rest of the corpse to be turned into 2 glittering gems, which will then be put into the eye sockets and then placed on the mantle to observe the ongoing comings and goings of the family for time immemorial. So this woman obviously does not want to do that. Some immediate legal flags are coming up. Dismembering a corpse is a state and federal crime. Also, who gets to keep the skull? I certainly would not want that at all, but probably throwing it away is another version of desecrating a body. However, if he puts this in his will, would that be legally binding? Is she required to do this? And so this is an example of why communication early and with a team, as Paul mentioned in this previous slides, is so important. I guess this guy is kind of a kooky guy, whatever, that's his prerogative. But you have to think about what your plans are doing to the people you're leaving behind. And if you do have sort of an out of the box idea, although hopefully nothing like this, it's important to run it by professionals so that your family is not in a position of grieving your loss and trying to figure out whether or not they're breaking the law by carrying out your plans. So that's just hopefully a memorable example for everyone of why it's important to communicate early and with a professional team. Okay, and so then with that, I will hand it back to Paul.
Okay, so thank you, Meha. And to give credit where credit is due, I did not find that. Pat Dillon, who is an attorney in Iowa, sent that to me one day, and it is a very good communications example in this, I think, because many of us come through this with ideas, and we kind of need to make sure it's going to work with everybody. So what are some possible tools you're going to need in all of this? Well, what if you have, minor children? Who's going to take care of them? What if you're taking care of minor grandchildren? Who's going to take care of them? Basically, who do you trust not to screw them up more in life? These are things you have to think about and maybe have long, difficult conversations with a spouse, with someone, with family members as to why you're not giving them children, to raise, why you're putting them in the hands of someone who may not be a family member. This may be a difficult conversation, but we have to think about it, and we will probably do this through the will. Who are going to be the beneficiaries that are designated? We've already kind of talked about potentially life insurance and other things that may come up in this where we've already designated beneficiaries. So these are areas where we need to, think about who's going to get in this. And these are things that may go outside the will that we're going to talk about here in a minute. The other thing we have to think about is who's going to take care of us when we're older? Who's going to have the business power of attorney? So we're going to have set powers of attorney. We're going to think about who's going to take care of our business interests. If we're dealing with our children, who's going to deal the best in the business? Who understands the farm business the best? Who's the most responsible to pay my bills for me at any given time? This may be, we may have to think about it. We may not have children who are competent to do this, and we may have to think outside of the immediate family who's going to do this. But these are things you have to think about as you're doing this. At the same time, you'll set up a healthcare proxy. Who's going to, make healthcare decisions for me? Which child cares the most about me? Which child did I not yell at, the most when they were a kid, and, will consider my health and all of this? These are other things we're going to have to think about too, along with business. I often point this out. You're probably going to have one kid that's potentially really good at business. That may not be the kid you want to have your healthcare proxy. That kid may not be the best at making decisions on your healthcare. The kid that can make the best decisions on your healthcare may be the one that can make that decision, but may not be able to make business decisions. We need to think about that and take that in consideration and make sure we're putting the best, either kid or other family member or friend in charge of those decisions that best benefit us. It's not at that point potentially about making sure your children are happy with, you for cutting them out. That's why our communication comes in and why we explain why these decisions are being made in the manner that they're being made. And if we pick one kid over another kid, we need to make sure that they're at least communicating enough so they'll share, if you're, in the hospital and need treatment, why this decision is being made about your health care and not another one's being made. And they'll at least loop their siblings in for why these decisions are being made. And we're not burdening all the children with these decisions to where they have to come to an agreement. We may also need to think about advanced healthcare directives. It's also known as a living will. If you've ever done one of these, they're the most fun document you'll ever do in your life. They lay out every way you could have healthcare issues where you may be unresponsive, you may be on life support, you may need X, Y, or Z done to you, and they'll lay out what you want done. We're going to talk about those here in a minute as well with powers of attorney. We'll talk about wills as well. We may need a trust. We may need life care or life insurance. We'll talk about that here in a second as well, I believe. So the will. The will is the simplest tool that's almost always used in all of these. It's going to lay out all how assets are distributed. It's also going to be used in collaboration with the other tools we're going to talk about here in a second. And like my He-Man gift says, he has the power. With the will, you have the power. You're the one making the decisions in the end. You're the one laying out who's getting what. You know, you can cut a kid out. You don't have to cut a kid out. You make the decisions. In all of this, you have the power to lay out how your assets will be distributed or how they won't be. So it's up to you, and it's something you have to think about and communicate with others on. Trust. These are a tool that's not really for everybody. They potentially provide better asset transfer and ability to equalize out assets between on-farm and off-farm heirs. The biggest thing that's going to come up in all of this is, especially if the bulk of the assets are on the farm, is how do we equalize assets between these two sets of heirs? We're probably going to have one kid that's working on the farm and one kid or multiple kids that are no longer a part of the farm. How do we equalize things so it doesn't feel like the kid that stayed on the farm got a windfall to the off-farm heirs? Now, the off-farm heirs may have, you know, other things going for them. They may have gotten education paid for where the on-farm heir didn't. And, you know, the on-farm heir may have grown the farm, given up things and done this. So it actually is fair, but it may not appear that way. Trust can allow us to do some of that where we keep, you know, the off-farm heirs as a part of the farm, but they really don't have control. We'll talk about some other ways we can do that. That might be easier in a minute. A living trust is sort of the thing that most people turn to. It's created during the trustor's lifetime, or you or whoever's creating the trust, and it can continue after your death or the trustor's death. Used by many people, it's basically used by many people to avoid the probate process upon their death. They're revocable, meaning that you retain control to change beneficiaries, trustee terms, whatever you need to do, dissolve it over the course of your lifetime. Once you die, it becomes irrevocable, and there's really limited powers to change the trust. Reasons to consider it: you might want to avoid probate costs. It's going to allow you to transfer property in different states. If you own farmland in 2-3 states, in Delaware, it's fairly easy to end up doing that potentially. You may want to consider this as a way, because then you don't have to probate the will in multiple states. It allows for the managing of assets. If you become incapacitated, you've already set up the trust to do this. It distributes the property to beneficiaries potentially much faster than the probate process. Reasons to not consider a living trust: they're expensive to set up. They have to be updated from time to time. They're going to require a little bit more lawyer work to get it set up and potentially administer if there's no one child that can administer it. And in a lot of cases, these expenses may outweigh the benefits. This is something you have to think about as you're setting these up. So when we're thinking about this, the other tool that can go with this, and is potentially going to be that most people are going to have, is the will. So why do we want to have a will? Well, we control the property until death. Most of you don't like to give up control at any point. None of us really do. This allows you to control every bit of your assets until you become either incapacitated or you pass away. You can direct who gets your property at any time. If one of your children makes you mad, you can change who gets that piece of property. You're going to have to pay the attorney each time you do this, but that's up to you to make that decision. You can select who's going to execute the will or make sure that your final wishes are taken care of. If you have guardians that need to come in for children, that will also come into play during this. Then once the will is distributed, you don't need it anymore. It goes away. Cons: you still got to probate it. That can be a timely and costly process depending on the state. Costs can vary depending on that. They're easily contested. Even if you have a no contest clause that most wills will probably include, if you leave a kid out for any reason, they or another potential heir they can challenge it in court. Trust sort of take that ability away if that is the concern. It takes time and it's a public process. These things are filed once you pass away. With the court, it becomes a public record. Anyone can go and look it up and take the time to understand how you divided up your property. But my question with most people is, unless we're one of the uber rich, who is really going to take the time to go look our wills up? It may not be. We may just have nosy neighbors that may make that decision down the road, but for most of us, it's probably not going to be a problem. The other issue that can come up with these is they're very state specific. They're based off of rules we took at founding from England, and the 50 states have varied them over the past, 200 plus years. So in some cases, there may be some uniformity depending on state law and what laws have been adopted, but in other cases, we may still be dealing with rules that have existed for hundreds of years, and we may not, we may need to make sure that if we have property in multiple states, it works in all states. So what are the deals with a living trust? So it eliminates the need for probate. We've kind of talked about that. It's not public. It's a very private document between the parties that are involved in the trust. There's nothing filed in the court with this. They're difficult to contest. You don't need to set up a guardian to hold assets for minors because you have the trust potentially already to do that. There's potentially trustee fees involved in all of this. It may be something we have to think about because there's a trustee involved in all of this. Now there are allowable fees that are allowed to be paid. It adds complexity to asset management because now we have to take into account the trust as we're doing all of this. There's need to coordinate with other estate planning tools. This doesn't take away the need for other estate planning tools, having the trust. We'll still need a pour over will. We'll still need all the other things we're going to talk about here in a second. Oh, and you're still going to need a will, as I just pointed out. What are some other tools we could think about? Well, we could use business entities. We could use an LLC or a corporation of some type to basically transfer the farm assets to, and then look at how do we create classes of ownership to potentially benefit an on-farm heir and an off-farm heir, to where the on-farm heir maintains control, but the on-farm heir maintains control of the farm, and the off-farm heir has some ability to at least collect, profits or some sort of revenue once it's distributed amongst the businesses. We may use multiple forms of these business entities to give interest to other, off-farm heirs to at least allow them to feel like they're part of the business. We may use long-term leases as a way to tie up farmland for the on-farm heir to at least then provide the off-farm heirs with some revenue down the road. We may look at conservation easements or preserving the farmland if it's available to bring in money to distribute, and at the same time tie the farmland up as farmland for eternity. We may look at life insurance if this is early enough in the process to where we can still get life insurance and afford it to sort of do some income equalization between the two parties involved in this, or multiple parties if we have one on-farm heir and multiple off-farm heirs. There are other tools we could consider using. It just depends on what the goals are. Goal setting is really important to help the attorney figure out what you want to do and what tools are going to be needed. Without that, it becomes really difficult, and it may just start looking like a standard estate plan where we're not putting much thought into how to develop it. Once we figure out what your goals are and what you want to do, it may become easier to figure out where you exactly fit in all of this and what tools are going to exactly work for you. My common example for a lot of estate planning is, how many people have been to a fast food restaurant in their life? And you go in and you just pick off the menu. The number one is probably almost the same no matter where you go. Estate planning is really not going to a fast food restaurant. It's going to a very fancy restaurant where the dish is being made specifically for you. Because you know, one size doesn't fit all potentially in this. We have to figure out what tools to put together to do this. It's also the point where I often remind people, don't talk to your neighbors about what they're using. Don't get tool envy by what they have in their estate plan. That may not be what you need. Their goals are going to be different than your goals, and their needs are going to be different than yours. So tools may differ depending on the farm. Like I said earlier, you're going to need a durable power of attorney to handle your financial needs or your financial issues that are going to arise. You're going to need a healthcare proxy to handle your healthcare issues. You're going to need a living will to handle what happens to you in certain situations. Imagine you're Homer, you fall off the side of this cliff. You're now, you know, in a medically induced coma, and, you know, Marge has to make a decision for you. That's what the living will is there to help with. Or if you're not in that dire circumstances, a healthcare proxy can help with a lot of this. Yeah. So as I pointed out earlier, what tools you use depend on your goals. Goal setting is going to drive this entire process as we move forward. And apparently I moved the slides around and screwed up the flow because this should have been earlier. The living will, it takes the burden off your family. This is why we're doing it. You've already decided what medical treatment you want. And again, who makes the best decisions for you at any point in your life? Is it your kids or is it you? It's probably you. You've made the decisions. Hopefully you've explained it to your kids why you're making that decision, and they don't have to worry about it. It's already done. They can just, you know, they have some peace of mind in those situations. So, you know, this question often comes up. I may need Anthony to put some more details in there. The question is a living will always followed? Oh, is it always followed by medical professionals? It should be, as long as it's a valid living will and it meets the requirements. And you're in those situations, it should be. It should almost always be filed by medical professionals. Yes. And this question comes up a lot. You know, at some point we may have to revise this document. You know, no plan's perfect. If you've created a perfect plan, it's perfect for that day. It's never going to be perfect probably past that day. The situation on the ground is almost always going to change, and we're going to have situational awareness for what's going on. One kink to always throw in this that you should think about is, if you have an on-farm successor, what happens if they pass away suddenly? Farming accident, you know, anything like that, what happens? What if they no longer want to farm? And for those that do not know this song, you should look up the S Lazy H. It's a really good, you know, song that's basically all about farm succession. It's by Cord Lunn. In a way, it really is all about farm succession. So these are things you have to think about, and how you're going to go about revising that plan once all of this happens. You know, you may have to sit down and go through the process again, talk to the heirs, make sure everybody's aware of what's going on in that situation, and understand how it's going to change at that point. If the off-farm heir passes away or doesn't want to farm, we may have to look at a new way that we're going to manage the business. We may need to rent it out. We may need something else. We may need to hire somebody and bring them in to run the farm. But at that point, the plan's going to change, and we have to think about it. And I think now it's Mayhaw's turn to take over.
Yep, thanks, Paul. So as we're kind of coming toward the end here of our session, and also the end of our 4-week webinar series, we wanted to share some additional resources that you can find online, in addition to the resources in the folders and the recorded sessions that will be made available to you if you don't have them already. Okay, so first I'll start with some of the resources available from our organization, University of Maryland Extension. It's a website called extensionumd.edu/ag transitions. And I do want to give a shout out to Lori, one of our partners here on this project. Her center is a big reason why we were able to get these materials up. So thank you, Lori. This page has a lot of reference materials similar to the topics we discussed today: interviewing an attorney, gift tax, inheritance, different things like that are available here. There's also some videos up here as well. Some other resources outside of our group of institutions, the University of Minnesota has a great ag transitions program. It's called the Center for Farm Financial Management. They have a lot of videos, they have some kind of worksheets and more interactive tools. So I definitely would consider checking that out. This is also something that may be attractive to the next generation or the younger generation. As someone from that probably younger generation, I can say I do kind of tend to trust, you know, these things I read online, these worksheets we get from the website. So you can, don't tell them I said that, but you know, if you feel like they're not listening to you, there may be a document on here that that generation might listen to. Some more resources available from one of our colleagues at Oklahoma State University. They have a great workbook. It's called the Farm Transitions Workbook. I believe this is available online, but now, Paul, correct me, is it free? I can't remember now.
It is free.
It is free. Okay, so this is still free. It's quite an extensive workbook that really focuses on the farm enterprises, that succession, that planning component that Lori had talked about, that Maria and Jesse had talked about regarding savings for retirement. It's a really nice document that, again, the generations can work through together. So then this last one is, I think, not free, but this is kind of the, I don't know, the OG, the original, you know, document on estate and business planning for farms from Iowa State. It's kind of a full sort of a textbook, full coverage approach to the process. It is $25, available at this URL. So if you feel like you just want like a one-stop shop, and this is a great one to look into. Okay, so just to sort of connect what we talked about today with our earlier webinars, which again, if they're not already in those folders, they will become available in the folders. Actually, I will, Paul, would you mind sharing that link in the chat to the session, the 4 folders of the sessions?
I can once you're done controlling my computer.
Oh, okay. Okay, we will send that out shortly. And also as a reminder, we do have a survey assessment of these sessions. They're really helpful for us to figure out how to improve our materials and make things more useful and interesting for you. All of us who work in Extension are, as all of us are, adjusting to this new reality of webinar-based meetings and not being able to meet in person and do these interactive things in person. So any suggestions you may have or ideas are more than welcome. I mean, you're the experts on how you want to hear this information. So to kind of connect all the pieces together then of these 4 sessions, you know, we talked about the legal tools, the financial tools, but a really important consideration is long-term healthcare insurance. Which is why getting that business planning in line, getting that financial planning in line is so important. And for more information on that, definitely check out the first 2 sessions from this series by Maria Papaitis and Jesse Ketterman. Thanks both of you if you're both still here. So this is an ongoing process. We need to evaluate our plan. For example, the tools and the checklist Lori walked through last week. You know, all of that planning is great, but as Paul just said, it's probably only perfect for that day. The next day you wake up and something's different and you need a new plan. Now, we don't want to drive ourselves crazy making a new plan every day, but maybe at least reading it once a year or every couple of years, and using those communication skills that Kay Megan talked about. You know, life happens and it needs to be reevaluated. And sometimes the things that happen in life are not that easy to navigate. It's hard to talk about. But using those active listening skills, those I statements, those values-driven discussions can probably help navigate some of this stuff. Okay, yes, here's the link. Thanks, Paul, for adding that in. And with that, we are done for today and done for the series. Any questions for any of us? You know, you've got us for the next few minutes, and we look forward to your comments. Thank you.